The four nurses didn't just leave the Kong estate. They fled as if the red-veined marble floors were made of hot coals and broken glass. The first one was sobbing, a jagged, wet sound that echoed off the high stone walls while she tripped over her own feet, her suitcase flying open to scatter cheap polyester scrubs across the gray granite chippings of the driveway. The second walked in a vacuum of silence, her eyes hollow as a dried-out calabash, staring at a horizon only she could see. The third was already screaming into her phone about hazard pay and psychological damages, her voice a sharp blade cutting through the humid afternoon. The fourth, a man built like a soldier who had probably served 3 tours in the heat of the desert, stopped dead in the middle of the driveway. He looked back at the black stone spires and the gargoyles that seemed to weep soot, then crossed himself with a trembling hand and whispered, "That thing in there is not human. He is the devil himself," before he turned and sprinted toward the iron gates. I walked past them without a sideways glance, my old canvas backpack digging into my shoulder like a heavy secret. My shoes were a disaster. The soles held together by strips of silver duct tape that collected the fine red dust of the driveway, but I kept my chin level. "People really need to learn how to handle pressure," I muttered, adjusting the strap. I had seen the face of Sapa and survived. I had watched my life crumble like dry Gary in a bowl. This mansion was just stone. It was big, sure, but it was just stone. The house loomed over me like a nightmare rendered in Gothic architecture, all black basalt and pointed spires that looked like needles ready to stitch the sky shut. Armed guards stood at the corners, their hands resting on the cold polymer grips of holstered weapons, eyes tracking me with the predatory stillness of hunters. I felt the familiar weight of being watched, the same way the eyebrows watch you at a bus park when they smell money. If I died here, nobody would notice my absence, just another leaf falling in a forest that didn't care for the shade. Mrs. O was waiting at the oak entrance, her face a map of buried secrets and exhaustion, holding a clipboard like a shield. She looked at my threadbare green scrubs, the specific shade of a bruised lime, and the dark circles under my eyes that felt like actual physical weights. She took in the way I stood, feet planted, ready to fight or collapse. "Are you the new nurse from the agency?" she asked. Her voice was dry like old parchment. I nodded, my fingers twitching against the frayed fabric of my bag. "That's me. Grace Bennett, ready for duty," I said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. It was a professional mask, one I'd worn until it felt more real than my own skin. Mrs. O didn't reach out. She didn't offer a hand. Instead, she asked, "Have you read the contract?" I told her I had. She leaned in, her scent a mix of mothballs and expensive gin. "Did you read the whole contract, including the fine print about not holding the Kong family liable for physical injury, psychological trauma, emotional distress, or death?" I felt a spark of something cold and sharp in my chest, a cynical heat that usually kept me from screaming. I particularly enjoyed the part about death. "Very reassuring," I replied. Mrs. O exhaled a long, weary breath that smelled of stale coffee. "Listen carefully, because Daehyun Kong is complicated." I shifted my weight, feeling the grit inside my shoes. "Is he complicated like complaining about thread count or complicated like throwing furniture?" I asked. Her eyes didn't blink. They were as flat as the lagoon at midnight. "He is complicated like 23 medical professionals in 6 months, and that did not count the ones who quit before their first shift ended. That caught me. It was a record. That was almost impressive, like some kind of world record for being impossible," I said. She didn't laugh. She looked at me like I was already a ghost. "This is not a joke," she snapped. I straightened my spine. "I know. But if I did not laugh, I would cry, and I have already cried enough for one lifetime. Besides, my mascara is not waterproof, and I only have 1 tube left and cannot afford another 1-inch. My mascara was a cheap brand from the market, thick and clumpy. I was broke. And being broke is its own kind of prison." Mrs. O turned without waiting, her heels clicking against the black marble floor with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. I followed, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird in a cage. The entrance hall was a cathedral of arrogance, the ceiling soaring 15 meters high into a gloom that even the massive crystal and gold chandelier couldn't fully pierce. It hung there like a monster made of light, faceted glass trembling every time a heavy door closed somewhere in the bowels of the house. Enormous oil paintings lined the walls, portraits of Korean men with ice-cold eyes and an expression that seemed to judge every step I took. They were portraits of generations of the Kong family, and not a single one looked like a man who knew how to smile. Their faces were carved out of privilege and cruelty. The floor was polished so perfectly that I could see my own reflection beneath my feet, a distorted green smudge of a woman moving through a palace of ghosts. Every few meters, a bodyguard stood motionless like a statue, eyes fixed forward, but I knew they were tracking the micro-movements of my shoulders. I wondered how many people had been dragged out of this hallway and never seen again. The air smelled of unrefined shea butter and the metallic tang of floor wax. It was too clean. It felt like a hospital for the damned. Mrs. O stopped abruptly before a spiral staircase of black oak, its railing carved with hunting scenes, wolves tearing into their prey with wooden teeth. "How tasteful," I muttered. Mrs. O glanced at me and explained that Dae-hyun Kang's grandfather had commissioned the staircase after killing his first enemy as a reminder to anyone entering the house that they were standing in a predator's territory. My throat felt tight, like I'd swallowed a handful of dry sand. I swallowed hard, but kept my voice steady. "Is there an elevator?" "I am a little afraid of heights," I asked. Mrs. O didn't smile. She just started up the stairs, her back a rigid line of duty. We passed the second floor with its closed doors that seemed to hold their breath. Then the third floor, where I caught a glimpse through a half-open door of a vast library with thousands of books stacked from floor to ceiling until they finally stopped on the fourth floor in the east wing. We stood before a pair of carved wooden doors nearly 3 meters tall. Mrs. O turned back to me with a look I couldn't read, half pity and half respect. "Before you go in, there are a few things you need to know. Dae-hyun Kang has not left this room in 3 months. He has refused light, refused people, refused even the act of living. He had a wound his shoulder and ribs from 3 weeks earlier that had become severely infected because he would not allow anyone to treat it. Dr. Tommy Chen, the only person permitted to come near him, had said that if this continued, he would be dead within a few weeks." I looked at the dark grain of the door. "Why does he refuse to be treated?" I asked. Mrs. O fell silent for a moment before saying, "It was because he did not want to be saved. He wanted to die, but was too proud to end it himself." A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but from recognition. I understood that feeling. I had stood on a bridge at 3 o'clock in the morning after my husband died, staring at the black water and wondering whether it would be cold. The heavy silence of the house pressed against my ears. It was the sound of waiting. Mrs. O continued, her voice dropping to a low rasp. Dae-hyun's father, Victor Kang, was dying of heart disease, that he had hired Grace at a salary 5 times the market rate. Not because he believed she could heal his son, but because he had run out of hope and only wanted to try one last time before both father and son were gone. I thought about the money. 5 times the rate. It was enough to stop the calls from the banks. Was that encouragement or a warning? I asked. Mrs. O's hand was on the door handle, her knuckles white. It was the truth, and that in this house, truth was a rare luxury, so she should value it. She placed her palm against the wood. Once Grace stepped inside, she would not be meeting a patient, but a wounded beast, and there was nothing more dangerous than a wounded beast that wanted to die. "Do you wish to turn back?" Because once this door opened, there was no retreat. I looked down at my shoes. The silver duct tape was peeling at the edge, exposing the frayed fabric. I thought of the $200,000 of debt crushing my shoulders. I thought of the nights spent sleeping in that car with an empty stomach and bone-deep cold. I hadn't had a way back for a long time. I was already in the belly of the whale. "I am ready," I said. "Open the door." Mrs. O pushed the door open and darkness spilled out like a living entity. It felt thick, like oil. I stepped inside and needed several seconds for my eyes to adjust to the near absence of light. Heavy black velvet curtains sealed every window, while only the faint fire in the corner fireplace cast a weak glow that sent ghost-like shadows dancing along the walls. The smell hit me then, whiskey mixed with antiseptic and the stale, sour scent of a man who had not left this room in far too long. The room was as large as a small apartment, cluttered with papers, liquor bottles, and dark paintings I didn't want to study too closely. I heard the door close behind me. I was alone in the devil's lair. And then I saw him. Dae-hyun Kang was not lying in bed as I had expected. He was seated in a leather armchair by the fire, his back straight like a king even as he was dying. He wore a black shirt unbuttoned at the top to reveal white bandages wrapped around his shoulder and chest, soaked through with blood and yellow fluid. His face was so pale, it was nearly gray, sweat beading on his brow. Yet his black eyes were sharp as razors as they locked onto me. I had seen many patients, the screamers, the beggars, the ones who had given up. But never anyone who looked at me as if I were an insect meant to be crushed. He said nothing for a long moment as his gaze traveled over my tangled hair, my worn clothes, and my battered backpack. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and cold like the bottom of a lake in winter. "Get out." I didn't move. I felt the heat from the fireplace, a dry, artificial warmth that didn't reach the center of the room. "What did you just say?" I asked, blinking. Dae-hyun didn't repeat himself. Instead, he stated, she had 30 seconds to return to that door and disappear from his house before he called someone to drag her out. I stood my ground, my arms hanging at my sides. "I am the nurse hired to care for him," I said, meeting those hell-dark eyes. Dae-hyun gave a humorless laugh, dry and empty. He did not need a nurse, did not need a doctor, did not need anyone, and especially did not need a girl who looked like she had just been thrown out of a shelter. The words cut into my chest like a blade, but cruelty was a language I spoke fluently. I had grown up with it. "Maybe you're right," I told him. "I look like trash." But trash was not afraid of being thrown away, and she was here to do her job. Dae-hyun tilted his head, eyes narrowing dangerously. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. I didn't flinch. "Ida. You are Dae-hyun Kang, the man people called the devil, that he ran an empire she did not want to know the details of, and that he could make her disappear without anyone ever finding her body." I took a step closer, into the circle of firelight. "I also know you are burning with fever, that your wounds are severely infected, and that without proper treatment in the coming weeks, you will die. So, did you want to spend your 30 seconds throwing me out or letting me change those foul-smelling bandages?" Dae-hyun rose from the chair then, and I realized he was taller than I had imagined, at least 1.85 meters, broad-shouldered, the build of a man who had once been very strong before illness had carved him down. He stepped toward me with every movement radiating threat, even as he clearly fought the pain tearing through his right shoulder. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough for me to feel the unnatural heat of his fevered body. "I have killed people for far smaller offenses than daring to talk back to me," he murmured. His breath smelled of expensive malt and decay. I lifted my gaze, my neck tilted back because of the height difference, yet I did not retreat a single step. "I believe you," I said. I had also been beaten by my own father for 8 years, had lived in an orphanage where older children burned her belongings for fun, had buried her husband 1 year ago, and was currently living in her car because she could not afford rent. I looked straight into his eyes, into the void there. "You could kill me if you wish. But you could not frighten me because she had been afraid enough for an entire lifetime, and she had nothing left to lose." Dae-hyun looked at me as if I had just grown a second head. No one had ever spoken to him that way, and lived. I could see the confusion in the way his pupils dilated. He turned and walked to the desk, his movements stiff, and picked up the phone. "Ji-hoon, come up here," he said. 2 words. That was all it took to summon a storm. Less than a minute later, the door opened, and a man as big as a bear appeared. Ji-hoon stood nearly 1.90 meters tall, his face carved with scars that looked like ancient riverbeds, and his hands were as large as shovels. He looked at me, and then at Dae-hyun with a silent question. Dae-hyun nodded toward me. "Throw her out." Ji-hoon moved toward me, each step making the floor seem to tremble. I did not run. I did not retreat. I simply stood there, and watched the giant approaching me. When Ji-hoon was close enough to grab my arm, I spoke. "Before you throw me out, I have a question." Ji-hoon stopped, not because of the question, but because of the strange, flat calm in my voice. Dae-hyun was watching too, his black eyes narrowing with a curiosity he couldn't hide. Why would a man as powerful as Dae-hyun Kong, a man who could buy an entire hospital if he wanted to, choose to die slowly in a dark room instead of putting a bullet in his head and being done with it? I let the question hang in the air, heavy and sharp. That was not the way of someone who truly wanted to die. It was the way of someone punishing himself. The room fell so silent, I could hear the fire crackling, a rhythmic snap hiss of sap. Ji-hoon stood frozen, glancing at his boss. Dae-hyun said nothing, but his jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his pale skin. I knew I had touched a wound far deeper than the one in his shoulder. I did not know what he had done, or why he believed he deserved to die. But I knew that look because she had seen it in the mirror for an entire year after her husband died. I told him about Marcus, about how he had begged me not to borrow money for his treatment, how he wanted to go gently, but I refused to listen. I borrowed $200,000, sold everything she could sell, forced him to endure 8 more months of chemotherapy from hell, only for him to die in agony anyway, and every day she wondered whether she had prolonged his suffering out of selfishness or out of love. And she never found an answer. I looked straight into Dae-hyun's eyes. 1 week after the funeral, she had stood on the Brooklyn Bridge at 3 o'clock in the morning, stared down at the black water below, and wondered if it was cold, that she did not jump, not because she wanted to live, but because she still owed money and did not want that debt to become anyone else's burden. I understood wanting to die. And I understood being unable to. Ji-hoon was now looking at me completely differently, his eyes softening from the coldness of an executioner to something like recognition. Dae-hyun remained silent, perched on the edge of his desk, his eyes never leaving my face. Finally, he asked why she was telling him all this. I didn't hesitate. I wanted him to know she was not a naive nurse who had come here hoping to save someone, that she came because she needed money and because she had nowhere else to go, that she was not afraid of him killing her because honestly, there were days she wished someone would do it for her, but she would still do her job because it was the only thing she knew how to do anymore. Dae-hyun stared at me for so long I thought he had turned to stone. Then he signaled to Ji-hoon and told him to leave. Ji-hoon nodded and exited without a word. Dae-hyun stood and walked slowly toward me, pain radiating from him like a physical heat. He stopped an arm's length away. 1 week, he said. I asked what he meant. You have 1 week to prove you are not an annoyance. That if during that week she bothered him, asked stupid questions, tried to lecture him about morality, or worse, showed him pity, she would be gone faster than all the others before her. I held out my hand, my skin dark against the gloom. What would happen if I made it through the week? Dae-hyun tilted his head. No one ever had, so he had not thought about it. I kept my hand there. Then we have a deal. Dae-hyun looked at my hand as if it were a venomous snake, but finally took it. His hand was twice the size of mine, burning hot with fever and trembling in a way an ordinary person wouldn't notice. But I was not ordinary. I noticed everything. I realized then that the devil everyone feared was just a man in so much pain he could no longer bear it, using cruelty as armor so no one would see the cracks. The next morning, I was awakened at 5 o'clock by a knock on the door of the small room Mrs. O had arranged for me at the far end of the corridor. It was Ji-hoon, holding a thick envelope. He handed it to me without a word and turned away. I opened it to find a stack of papers 15 pages thick. Rules for medical staff assigned to Dae-hyun Kong. I sat on the edge of my bed and began to read. Rule number 1. Lights were not to be turned on. Curtains were not to be touched. Rule number 2. Do not speak unless directly addressed. Answers must be brief and contain no more than 10 words. Rule number 3. No eye contact longer than 3 seconds. Rule number 4. Do not touch the patient without verbal consent. Rule number 5. Medication must be placed exactly 90 centimeters from the head of the bed with the label at a 45 degrees angle. I wondered if he used a protractor. The list went on.
No phones.
No white clothing. No red clothing.
No perfume.
Rule number 37. Do not breathe too loudly within a radius of 2 meters. I finished reading and laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. All right, I told myself. The game begins. At 6 o'clock, I appeared at Daehyun's door, wearing a light gray outfit. I knocked 3 times as required by rule number 23. A voice from inside granted permission. I pushed the door open with my shoulder. Rule number 19 said the left hand was not to be used. The room was pitch dark. I stepped to the table and set the tray down. I pulled a measuring tape from my pocket and measured exactly 90 centimeters. Then I took out a protractor and adjusted the medicine box to precisely 45 degrees. I straightened my spine. The medication had been placed according to specifications, sir, I said, my voice clinical. Should I bring a laser alignment device next time for greater accuracy? Daehyun said nothing, but one eyebrow lifted. I continued. I had also checked the water temperature with a calibrated thermometer, and it was exactly 18 degrees Celsius as requested. However, she felt obliged to warn him that within 3 minutes the temperature would drop by approximately 5 degrees due to the ambient room temperature. So, if he wished to drink it at exactly 18 degrees, he had approximately 180 seconds from now. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. He asked whether she was mocking him. I replied that I would never dare. She was merely following the rules he himself had established with strict precision since he had clearly invested a great deal of time and effort into creating such an impressively detailed list. Daehyun rose and walked toward me, each step deliberate like a panther. He stopped directly in front of me. 23 people before her had either run away or cried or begged upon reading that list, he said. I looked up at him. Those 23 people had clearly never had to read the regulations of the public hospital where she once worked because compared to those rules, his list resembled a kindergarten instruction manual. I added that I noticed a flaw in rule number 15 regarding food definitions. Technically, she could bring in an apple since an apple was fruit and not food under certain definitions. Daehyun stared at me in silence. Then, he let out a short, dry chuckle. It was a mechanical sound, like a rusted machine struggling to remember how it functioned. Very well, little nurse. If she wanted to play this game, then they would play. He was curious to see how long I would keep smiling. I smiled back, the expression feeling like a victory. I was curious, too. And now, with his permission, she needed to change the dressing on his wound because, in her observation, it was seeping through his shirt, which indicated a more severe infection than she had initially thought. The game could wait, but the wound could not. On the first night, he called at 2 a.m. The second night, it was 3 o'clock. On the third night, he waited until 4:15. He was testing my breaking point. Every time, I woke, dressed in the approved gray, and appeared within 5 minutes. On that third night, he sat on the bed, eyes tracking me in the dark. He wanted water. I prepared it. When I returned with the tray, arranged with the absurd 45-degree angle, I placed it down. Suddenly, Daehyun swept his hand out and knocked the tray to the floor. Metal clanged sharply against wood. Water spilled. Pills scattered like lost teeth. I looked down at the mess, then at Daehyun. He watched me with an icy, detached gaze, waiting for the crack in my resolve. I did not scream. I did not cry. I silently knelt and picked up each pill. I wiped the floor with a cloth from my pocket. She would return with a new tray, I said calmly. I left and came back 10 minutes later. He knocked it down again. The third time he did the same. The fourth as well. On the fifth time, as I gathered the pills, I paused. Her father used to throw dinner plates against the wall every night when he was drunk, and she had to pick up every shard, every grain of rice, every scrap of food while he stood there hurling insults. That she did it for 8 years until her hands hardened from broken porcelain and her heart hardened from words. I looked up at him. You could throw this tray down 100 times and she would pick it up 100 times because this was her job and she had done far worse things than picking up pills at 4 a.m. I told him I wondered if he truly wanted me gone or if he was just looking for someone patient enough to stay. Daehyun said nothing. I stood up. I would get another tray, and that this time, she hoped he would leave it alone because pain medication was not cheap and she hated waste. I turned toward the door. "Wait," he said. I heard the rustle of sheets, the sound of him bending down. When I turned, he was standing there holding the silver tray he had knocked down. He placed it on the table without looking at me. "Get new medication," he said. I looked at the tray. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get from a man like him. I nodded. I would return in 5 minutes. When I stepped out, I allowed myself to smile. Not because I had won, but because I realized that beneath the devil's armor, there was still a man capable of feeling. The infection was deep, but the man was still there. And for a woman with duct-taped shoes and a hollow heart, that was enough of a reason to stay for another week. On the 5th night, everything changed. I was lying on my bed in that small room, staring at a crack in the ceiling that looked like the map of a country I never wanted to visit. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a sound drifted down the hallway, not the sharp ping of the call bell, but a low, guttural moaning. It was the sound of something striking against heavy mahogany furniture and fragmented, incoherent speech. I jumped up, not even bothering to throw on a sweater over my thin camisole, and ran toward Dae-hyun's room. Because I knew that sound. It was the sound of a soul trying to exit a body that wasn't finished with it yet. I pushed the door open, and the sight froze the blood in my veins. Dae-hyun was on the floor, his right leg tangled in the heavy silk sheets as if he'd tried to stand and the world had tilted on its axis. Sweat soaked through his black shirt, making the fabric cling to his ribs like a second, bruised skin. His eyes were wide, blacker than the room, but they were seeing things I couldn't. He was delirious. I rushed to him, my knees hitting the floor with a dull thud, and pressed my palm against his forehead. His skin burned like a hot coal left in the rain. I estimated at least 40 degrees Celsius, maybe more. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a frantic bird in a wicker cage. I called his name, but he didn't hear me. Instead, he began to speak in broken, indistinct phrases, and then he breathed a name. "Luca," he kept calling for Luca. His voice was trembling with a raw, jagged pain that made my own chest ache. "I am sorry, Luca."
He was sorry.
"Please do not go. Please do not leave." I didn't know who Luca was, but I knew that specific frequency of grief. It was the same sound I'd made when Marcus's hand went cold in mine. There was no time for questions. I ran to the bathroom, grabbed heavy towels, and soaked them in ice water until my own fingers went numb. I began cooling his neck and the pulse points at his wrists. I called Dr. Tommy Chun, the only man allowed in this fortress, and he arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag clicking as he set it down. Tommy administered high-dose antibiotics and a fever reducer through an 4-line, his movements precise and mechanical. He looked at the wound. The edges were angry, weeping a yellowish fluid that smelled of rot and neglected pride. Tommy said the wound was far more severely infected than he had thought, and that if Dae-hyun continued to refuse proper treatment, he would not survive the month. I asked why he was doing this to himself. Tommy went silent, his hands steady as he titrated the drip. It was not his story to tell, but that it involved Luca, Dae-hyun's younger brother and also Tommy's closest friend. Luca had died 3 years earlier, and Dae-hyun had never forgiven himself. Tommy left at 4 o'clock in the morning once the fever had dropped to 38 degrees. I pulled a chair to the bedside and sat. The room was silent except for the rhythmic hiss of the fire dying in the grate. Dae-hyun remained unconscious, his face finally softening in the shadows. Without the mask of the monster, he looked exhausted, a man who had carried the world on his back until his spine snapped. Suddenly, his hand reached out and closed around mine. I startled, but I didn't pull away. His grip was hot and desperate, like a drowning man catching a piece of driftwood. He called Luca's name again. "Do not go. I am sorry. I should have saved you." I didn't know the story, but I knew the weight. I tightened my grip, my fingers interlacing with his. I spoke softly into the dark, telling him I was here. Telling him he wasn't alone. I stayed there all night, my hand never leaving his, my eyes never leaving his face, as the fever finally broke into a cold sweat. I didn't notice when I slumped forward, my head resting against the edge of the mattress. And when Dae-hyun woke at the first pale light of dawn slipping through the curtains, the first thing he saw was me, asleep beside his bed, my hair a mess, my small hand still holding his, as if I were the one afraid of him disappearing.
He watched me for a long time.
He didn't pull his hand away. For the first time in 3 years, the devil let someone stay. I woke with a neck that felt like it had been twisted by an angry ogre. I snapped upright, realizing I was still by his bed. Dae-hyun was watching me, his eyes fully awake and terrifyingly lucid.
I didn't know how long he'd been staring.
I pulled my hand free, the skin where we'd touched feeling strangely cold now. I stammered an apology, saying I hadn't meant to fall asleep. My heart was doing a frantic dance in my throat. I grabbed the thermometer, checking his stats. 375. Better. I began the morning ritual, cleaning the wound with saline and a steady hand. The infection was retreating, but the silence between us was growing. As I packed my kit, his voice cracked the quiet. He asked whether she had sat there all night. I nodded without looking up. He paused, then asked why. Why she stayed, why she held his hand. He had not paid her to do those things. I turned to face him then. In his eyes, there wasn't the usual ice. There was a genuine, terrifying confusion. He didn't understand kindness without a price tag. He had been calling someone's name in his delirium, and she could not leave when someone was in that much pain, I said. He turned his face toward the window. Luca, he whispered. I asked who he was. Dae-hyun's voice was flat, like a calm sea before a storm. Luca was his younger brother. Luca was dead, and it was his fault.
He didn't cry.
Men like him don't have tears. They have lead in their veins. I sat down and told him about Marcus. I told him that facts aren't the same as feelings. Marcus had forgiven her before he took his last breath. But she had never been able to forgive herself. Keeping someone alive when they wanted to go wasn't an act of heroism. It was an act of selfish desperation. I told him I knew what it felt like to look in the mirror and see a killer. We sat there, two people whose lives had been broken by love and pride, and for a moment, the mansion felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. He didn't offer comfort. He just nodded, a slow, heavy movement. He understood. I stood up to get his breakfast, and as I reached the door, he called my name.
Thank you, he said.
2 words. They sounded like a mountain moving. I smiled, a real one this time, and stepped out. My heart was racing for a reason that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way he looked at me, as if I were the only thing in the world that made sense. The second week brought the storm. Her name was Natasha Volov. She burst into the room without a knock, a tall woman with hair the color of expensive champagne and eyes that could freeze the sun. 2 massive bodyguards trailed her, with Ji-hoon looking like he wanted to snap their necks for the intrusion. She sat in the chair opposite Dae-hyun, as if she owned the air he breathed. She was the daughter of a Russian associate, here to discuss a proposal that smelled like a threat. I stood by the table, my medical kit in hand, feeling like a shadow. Natasha looked at me as if I were a stain on the carpet. "What is this?" she asked, her voice like a velvet whip. I didn't wait for Dae-hyun to answer. "I am Mr. Kang's nurse, and I am doing my job." So, if Ms. Volov did not mind, she needed to change the patient's bandages, Natasha scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Oh, it talks," she turned back to Dae-hyun. "Since when did he allow servants to speak when guests were present?" Heat rushed to my face. "I am a nurse. I am a professional. I am not a servant." I told her that she was medical staff, and whether Miss Volkov was a Russian princess or the Queen of Hell, she would still do her job. Natasha sprang to her feet, her blue eyes blazing. She stepped close, her perfume a cloying, chemical floral scent. She told me I didn't know who I was talking to. She said people like me didn't get to look people like her in the eye. Dae-hyun's voice cut through the air like a gunshot. "Sit down and let her work." Natasha froze. She couldn't believe it. But she sat. I changed the bandages, my hands steady, while I felt her gaze burning a hole in my back. When I left, I heard her speak in Russian, a low, rhythmic threat. I didn't need a translator to know I had just made an enemy who didn't take no for an answer. 3 nights later, the darkness in Daehyun's soul spilled over again. I found him by the fireplace, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and the scent of regret. It was Luca's birthday. He told me the whole story. How Luca wanted to be a doctor, to be different from the family business. How he'd been kidnapped by a rival gang. They demanded that he withdraw from 3 Brooklyn districts and pay a $5 million ransom. Daehyun could have paid. But he was the leader. He had to think of the bigger picture. He refused to negotiate, believing he was smarter, believing he could rescue Luca his own way. He was wrong. A wooden crate was delivered to his door. Inside was Luca. He hurled a bottle into the fire, the glass shattering with a sound like a scream. He had killed his brother. His arrogance had done it. He chose pride over his brother's life. I sat with him while the fire died. I told him death wasn't atonement. It was an escape. If he died, the pain would not disappear. It would simply pass to others. He looked at me, then reached out and brushed a tear from my cheek. It was a brief touch, but it felt like a vow. That night, he didn't sleep alone in the dark. I stayed until the sun started to bleach the sky. The 3rd week brought my own ghost. My mother, Sarah Bennett, appeared at the gate. She looked like a faded version of the woman who had abandoned me 19 years ago, smelling of cheap gin and desperation. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted $50,000 to pay off her gambling debts. She threatened to go to the press, to tell the world about the poor nurse living with a mafia boss. I felt small, a child again, waiting for the blow. But then Daehyun was there. He stood in the doorway, his presence an absolute weight. He told her I was under his protection. He told her she had 30 seconds to leave before the people she owed found her. He called me his after she fled. I broke. The years of being strong, of being the one who survived, they just crumbled. I cried in that silent room, and Daehyun sat with me. He didn't have soft words, but he had a steady shoulder. He told me humans always hope, even when they know it will hurt. He said that was what separated us from monsters. And for the first time, the distance between us vanished. We were just 2 people trying to stay afloat in a very deep sea. The attack happened when I went to pick up his meds. I thought I was safe. I thought the daylight would protect me. 2 men cornered me in an alley. Natasha's regards. I fought. I kicked, I swung my bag, I used a piece of broken glass. I had lived in Lagos. I knew how to fight for my life. But they were too many. A man raised his fist, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the dark. Instead, I heard the snap of bone. Marco was there. He was a whirlwind of professional violence. He brought me back to the estate, blood dripping from my lip, my green scrubs torn. When Daehyun saw me, the air in the room seemed to vanish. He didn't yell. He just took me from Marco, his touch impossibly gentle. He made a call to Natasha's father. His daughter had laid hands on someone who belonged to him. If it happened again, the alliance would end along with Natasha's life. Later in my room, he told me he didn't know how to love. He didn't know if he had the right. But he knew that when I was hurt, his heart ached, as if the knife had gone into him. He asked me to stay. Not as his nurse, but as Grace. I looked at him, this man who was my devil and my sanctuary, and I said yes. A year later, the Luca Kong Clinic opened its doors in the Bronx. It was a lighthouse of glass and steel. I stood on the stage, pregnant with our first child, my hand in Daehyun's. He had moved the business into the light, away from the blood of the past. When it was my turn to speak, the world tilted. I swayed, and he caught me, his face pale with fear. Tommy laughed when he realized the truth. "You are going to be a father," I told him. The great Daehyun Kong, the man who had faced armies without blinking, stared at me, his mouth open, and then he simply fainted. The room erupted in laughter. As I patted his cheek to wake him up, I realized the debt was paid. Not with money, but with a life. Our story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a reclamation. We had both been discarded, but together, we were whole. The devil had found his heart, and the poor nurse had finally found her home. And that, I realized as he opened his eyes and smiled at me, was the only rule that mattered.